I'm Natalie, and I'll be talking about my experience with the AntiFascist Oral History Project. The word Antifa has become somewhat of a buzzword recently. It conjures up images of angry, masked protesters wielding sticks and shields. But who are anti-fascists, and what do they actually stand for? How does this fit, historically, with the ideals of the United States? Personally, I identify as an anti-fascist. I've been active around Boston in recent protest activity, but in order to understand the historical context of anti-fascism and today's activist scene more specifically, I spoke with Mark Tinkelman, who has been active in the anti-fascist movements for years. We first spoke about the history of anti-fascism. In the 1930s, when Nazism was on the rise, many Americans rallied around the idea of white supremacy. Only when the United States formally entered World War II was anti-fascism acceptable. Americans considered themselves above the violence of Hitler, even while the Ku Klux Klan gained in popularity. Suddenly, it became patriotic to despise Nazis and all they stood for. In short, this isn't the first time the United States has struggled with these issues. So my next question was, what's changed? Why is there so much pushback against anti-fascism this time around, only a few generations removed from World War II? Mark blames, above all, ignorance and misinformation. He says that today, Antifa is perceived as an organized, violent group that seeks to undermine the institutions that make Americans feel safe. While some elements of this are true, Mark says, the reality of anti-fascist activism has been laughably exaggerated. In fact, the most important element of anti-fascism has been protecting the oppressed. Often anti-fascist activists step in when fights break out. They may join the fray, but often it is a strategy to try to buy time for those being attacked to get away. Other times, like the now iconic punching of white supremacist Richard Spencer, are seen by anti-fascists as a way to push back against the rising tide of white supremacy. Mark explains that this specific example was as much a message to the media as it was to Spencer himself. A message that this ideology does not deserve acceptance or tolerance. White supremacy doesn't even deserve a platform. When I asked Mark about left-leaning individuals who were turned off by these displays, he argued that any violence anti-fascists use is in direct response to violence from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other fascists. This violence is composed of outright violent acts upon people of color, as well as indirect, institutionalized violence that excludes vulnerable people from basic necessities like housing and clean air, food, and water. Mark argues that those who are uncomfortable with anti-fascist violence should also be uncomfortable with these examples. Their silence on these issues, Mark says, is hypocritical and ultimately part of the problem. It was here that I began to understand the real importance of a project of this kind for anti-fascists. Antifa is not a singular organized group. It has no leader, it has no one message. It is largely composed of passionate individuals who seek to address the oppression they see directly. They organize locally, based on geographic, like Mark's group, which is based in Philadelphia, and they also organize around issues of identity. There are anti-fascist groups specifically for people of color, there's a nationwide group of anti-fascist atheists, and there's even a group of anti-fascist witches. This grassroots movement's lack of direct leadership means that their motives and actions can be warped by the media, which seeks a simple way to define a very complex group. Opponents of anti-fascist activism also use Antifa's disparate organizational structure to undermine its legitimacy. But it's precisely this organizational structure that allows anti-fascist activism to work as effectively as it has. Groups based around geographic locations are able to mobilize quickly to organize counter-protests. Groups that cater to specific identities allow those individuals freedom from the judgment and persecution they may otherwise face. An oral history project which allows these individuals to put their thoughts and feelings into their own words is an important way to combat misinformation about anti-fascists. It can unify their message without forcing them into an organizational structure that won't work for them.